for lifters is don't believe everything you see on the internet. I guess this is a very useful information now. I think understanding survivorship bias is very important. People talk about the success of what this person does, and then try to replicate it, but that's just survivorship bias. There might be 10,000 people that actually did the same thing, actually fail, right? But there's this one person and you try to follow that, you might just be another stat of this person that failed. So just because a lifter online, that maybe you admire does something, doesn't mean that it will translate to you.
Hi, Kedric. It's my pleasure to have you on the Evidence Strong show. If you could briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me. My name is Kedric Kwan. I recently completed my PhD focusing on acute body mass manipulation for the strength athletes. So typically powerlifters and to a certain extent weightlifters with 2-hour weights. So that's kind of like where my research area is. I'm also the co-founder of online coaching company called Reformance. And yeah, I do primarily nutrition coaching and powerlifting coaching for a lot of powerlifters in the IPF, which is a 2-hour weigh-in drug-free powerlifting federation. So that's kind of like my background.
So it's very, very similar to Olympic weightlifting, also 2 hours and drug tested. So I think your knowledge is relevant to any athletes who are training and trying to improve drug-free in the weight constraint or weight class oriented sports. So where the strength and power generation is really important. What should be the approach, the nutritional approach to powerlifting to improve performance in strength sports?
I do think that for any weight class restricted sport in the 2-hour weigh-in, it's going to be important to understand where you should be in terms of the right weight classes. I know that when it comes to weightlifting, the weight classes do change quite frequently, and if you are competing in like the world championships versus the Olympics, the weight classes are different as well, right? We don't really have that in powerlifting, so it's not as complicated. I've worked with a couple of weightlifters in the past, so I kind of am aware of the differences in terms of that different weight category change in a short period of time. But in terms of the most important thing, I would say is that you have to find which weight class is right for you. I do think that understanding which weight class you're in that you can really maximize your ability, and what maximizing your ability means, I would expand on it further, would be important. So people often say weight classes are height classes in disguise, right? So, the taller you are, the likelihood of you being in a higher weight class is greater, right? Because you can remove all muscle tissue, fat tissue, right? But a taller person would likely be heavier just because they have more skeletal structure, right? So they have more bone mass. So given a larger skeletal structure, they would probably already be heavier. Not to mention that, people who are taller can tend to be able to they can be stronger by maximizing certain leverages, so with more tissue surrounding their joints, or surrounding their skeleton, they tend to be a little bit more, they tend to perform slightly better. Let's just say, for a good example would be squatting, right? People who are very tall and lanky, naturally you have proportions where people can squat a little bit more upright, but let's just say all things being equal, somebody who's taller and probably have bigger glutes, right, would be able to kind of like bounce out of the hole a little bit better compared to someone who is taller, the same height, but has no additional mass to give them that nice bounce. So typically the taller you are, you tend to benefit more from being slightly heavier, whether that's fat mass or muscle mass. People can make certain distinctions. Not all fat mass is bad, because like I said, sometimes fat mass does improve certain leverages. People talk about like the squat belly, right? People give it like the nice bounce out of the hole. So that is the first thing, understanding what weight class you should be in. And then the second bit would be your ability to sustain your training and recovery with the energy intake that you consume. My approach to power nutrition coaching is not so much focused on the weight, right? I think that the unfortunate aspect of powerlifting coaching is that we have to always be mindful of the weight, right? And sometimes overemphasizing on numbers can be a little bit detrimental mentally, because, if you are not a weight class restricted athlete, people don't really care about the weight on the scale, right? People tend to care about how they look, how they feel in their clothing, regardless of the weight. So the unfortunate thing is that being in a weight class sport, you have to be mindful of the weight. So the way I frame the approach is not so much of thinking about the weight too much, but thinking about what do you have to consume to support your training and recovery, and your weight gain is just like a necessary secondary effect, right? So if you need to eat X amount of food to sustain your training, but if your weight goes up, that is potentially where you should be in terms of your weight class, right? There's no point training hard and under recovering, and also by eating less and being in a constant cycle of energy deficit may also actually increase certain injury risk. So that is the second thing. Of course, the next bit would be, what if I'm 2% or 3% above my weight class? Then that is the fact. Then you can add some form of acute body mass manipulation, or people, we call it weight cutting, right? Weight cutting strategies, bring your body weight down prior to competition. But a large majority of your time is spent at that sort of like that Goldilocks zone where your training and recovery is being maximized, and the weight you're in is just a secondary effect of it. So those are kind of like the three factors. I would say height is a big one, your ability to sustain that lifestyle that you lead, and the last but not least is, how much can you lose by performing some form of weight cutting strategy.
So for deciding, you take into account how tall the lifter is. So what is it a proxy for potential? How much of muscle mass first and then body mass they are able to hold on the frame they are given genetically. Then the second would be how much they need to be consuming to sustain the training protocol they are on, considering their goals and where they're going, and whether they are able to recover from the training protocol they are doing. And what was the third?
The ability to successfully perform some form of rapid weight cut to make weight for competition.
What do you mean by ability to perform rapid weight cut?
So there's always when looking at studies that has been done, especially in powerlifting, right, or any strength sport, which isn't many, right, there's like this zone where most people are quite safe, right? When I say successful, I mean the ability to maximize your chances of performing your best in that particular weight class that you're cutting down to, right? So it's not like, I cut weight, but I absolutely destroyed myself and messed up the whole powerlifting comp. So in that context, I would say that most of people tend to gravitate towards a roughly 2 to 3.5% weight cut. That is kind of like the mean of magnitude of weight loss that powerlifters tend to perform. Of course, when we take into individual variations at the higher end, elite lifters tend to cut a little bit more, right? And if you have a lifter who is very inexperienced to cutting, you probably want to start on the slightly lower end. There will always have to be a first time, right, where a lifter decides, I'm going to be cutting, right? And that first time tend to be the hardest because you have no prior experience. Safe range is roughly 2 to 3.5%. I think that is something that most lifters should be able to do. If someone is new to rapid weight cutting, you gravitate towards a lower end, and if you're an elite lifter, there are multiple strategies that you can use to kind of like greater amounts of weight, but also it probably requires practice. And, there are certain strategies that you can do to help your body adapt towards a higher amount of weight loss in the final couple of days leading to competition. So you can go up to 4-5%. And I would probably say that those are the range, 2 to 3% for this general population. Maybe if just under 1 to 1.5% for someone who is just trialing things out. And I think that for the upper limit, most elite lifters can cut up to 5%. That those are like certain numbers that I would say can be a good guide. Although I do think that percentage does not scale according to weight classes, right? So 5% for someone in a 60 kilo weight class, right, is 3 kilograms. 5% for someone in the 120 kilo weight class is 6 kilograms. So it's double the amount. But I don't think that the weight loss actually scales linearly, meaning that I think that there should be absolute cutoff, especially as your weight increase. So I'm not sure what the absolute cutoff is in terms of how many kilograms. But yeah, in general, I would say like the numbers of percentage of body loss tend to be a little bit more applicable if you're in the lower weight classes. As you approach closer towards the 90 to 100 plus kilo range, then the percentage of weight you can lose may not necessarily reflect relative body mass loss in percentage.
Why is that?
It's hard to say, honestly. I think that the hypothesis that I have is that if you look at someone who is really big, right, and really small, let's just say a person who's 60 kilos and a person who's 120 kilos, it is like unlike that their kidneys, right, which is responsible for water regulation, is double the size, right, of someone, right? And if you look at certain organs and functions, that someone who is 120 doesn't have a stomach that is like double the size of someone who's 60 kilos, right? So a lot of the weight loss from rapid weight cutting strategies usually deal with food mass, right? The amount of water that someone can lose. So I think that if those things that are responsible to process those sort of like substance is not larger, right, I don't think that it scales accordingly. So because at the end of the day, what we are losing is not tissue. We are trying to lose sort of like non-tissue weight, and those organs or systems responsible for it is not doubly large or doubly efficient just because somebody is 2 times the body weight. So I don't think that it scales accordingly. But that's just my hypothesis, right? So
no, I really appreciate that. Was something I found interesting. Do you work mostly with elite lifters, or do you have range of lifters?
I have a range of lifters, although large. I mean, it depends what you mean by elite. So if you have like people, let's just say anybody that goes to the world championships, if you call them elite, then I do work with a large number of lifters at the world championships. But I also have lifters that do not go to the world championships as well, right? So a wide range of lifters. I also have worked with some people in the past. I just worked with like body recomposition, people who want to look better, and feel better, right? So more body composition and health related changes. So yeah, but I would say that a large majority of the lifters I work with are those competing in the World Championships, or at least have the goal of qualifying to go to the World Championships, I actually do encourage people to actually move up the weight class rather than go down a weight class, because ultimately powerlifting is still a growing sport, right? And until it grows to the level of like weightlifting, and some might say weightlifting is also on the slight decline, right? But until it grows to that level, it is still a relatively it's basically an expensive hobby for most people, right? And I would say that people go into lifting, right, to kind of like improve their well-being. And I know that any form of athletic endeavor would cause some form of risk of injury, because like any sport, even if you play football, if you play tennis, there's always
swimming, whatever,
there will be injuries, right? But if I can mitigate the risk of injuries for most people, right, and like I said, even though I work with a lot of elite lifters, most people don't fall into that category, right? Which means that the risk to reward ratio is extremely low, right? Even for elite lifters, right, you go onto the podium, maybe your sponsors pay you a couple of like $1,000 if you go on the podium, but you get paid like a couple of $1,000 for a year, right? Even then, the risk to reward ratio, even for elite lifters, is not as high, right? What more for someone who is just doing this casually and they just want to get better. So in general, I would say that moving up a weight class would likely we will be able to balance the element of health and performance at the same time. So that is my general predisposition for most people.
Would you still manipulate the diet in, I don't know, increasing quality or controlling it maybe a little bit more? Or what is your approach in the long-term lifter development?
I think the most important thing is, like I said, looking at certain signs. For females, is easier because if their menstrual cycle become very irregular, that is because that's a clear physiological sign. Although in men as well, right, testosterone would drop. It's basically men go through the same thing when they're dieting into like really low body weight, but men doesn't have the physical display of losing menstrual cycle compared to women. So for women, that's really easy to see, right? That those are we have certain clear red flags out there. Of the big one as well is to also look at the ability to recover from session to session. What is like the injury risk. Those are things that we have to manage, right? So I think that at the end of the day, all things being equal, right, eating more food in general would probably be better than eating less, right? It also probably tends to make people a little bit happier.
Yes.
So if the lifter is happier doing certain things over an extended period of time, I think that the individual will stick to that thing a little bit more. So I think it increases the longevity in the sport, especially like I said, people can, if you have $500,000 on the line, you will probably say, I'm gonna do everything short of killing myself to achieve that. But if all you're doing is just try to put like 15 kilos on your total, sometimes people just be like, this is not worth it anymore, and they can just quit the sport, right? There is no stakes, right? But someone who loves the sport, who works in the sport, and who also benefit from the sport from obviously like a professional and financial perspective, I want people to enjoy the sport, right? So I think that is very important as well. It's just like, people who do things that make them happy tend to stay longer in the sport in general. So that's why I said that, in general, eating more would tend to increases the probability of someone staying in the sport, which is why I think that always cutting weight is probably not a great idea for most people.
So how often would you consider it's okay?
I think that for powerlifting is actually interesting because it's not so much the frequency of cutting weight, because when we look at combat athletes, they actually weight cycle very frequently, right? So they can go to a fighting competition, right? Like maybe 11 to 12 times a year, they can fight once a month, right? Which means that every time they have to make weight. But because a lot of combat sports, they tend to have longer periods of rest before the competition. After that weigh-in, they can cut bigger amounts of weight, which means that they still can eat a fair bit, right? And then cut down and still perform relatively well, right? Although there are negative impacts as well with like weight cycling in that fashion. But when you look at a power lifter, because the amount of weight they cut is so small, and the time to replenish after their weigh-ins is so short, they have to maintain a low body weight, right? Almost year round, right? Relatively around 3 to 5% above their body weight at maximum. And for some people, that is just not sustainable, right? You don't, whereas, if you're a fighter, you can be like 10% body weight, jump into the sauna, sweat and all that. Not to mention that I think that larger weight cutting, if you were to put a combat athlete and a powerlifter and they lose the same amount of weight, I would probably say that the likelihood of the combat athlete performing better is higher, because not every combat sport requires body mass. So for example, sports that are more striking in nature, like potentially like taekwondo or boxing, right? You don't need as much mass, right? Obviously, if you have judo, right, or Brazilian jiu-jitsu where your body mass matters more, right, then your mass is much more important. However, when it comes to strength sport, the ability to pack on mass, right, is basically directly correlated to your ability to produce force, especially in the long run. So I don't just think about what is my performance, how is my performance being impacted by the weight cut, but I also think about what am I leaving on the table by not actually having the ability to add more muscle mass. So from that perspective, if you think about, if I have to stay in this weight class, instead of putting on 5 kilos, and that 5 kilos will not all be muscle, especially in the short run, how much of additional muscle mass can actually can contribute towards my performance. So I do think that the ability to think about it's not so much how frequent one should do it, but it's more about what is the time you spend at a low body weight, right? And how does that impact your lifestyle? And what is the trade-off of being in that low body weight versus actually going up a weight class and packing on muscle mass?
Are there any percentages you would advise, or what would be the timeline when the lifter, or would it happen naturally just by fueling properly for training? How would you go about increasing the weight? Let's say the athlete is on the line and they're deciding they would have to cut 5%. It's maybe not worth it, or it didn't work before. They really struggle with it, makes them unhappy, and they lose all the passion for the sport. Or maybe they are a young lifter and we know that they had no chance to stay in this weight class. They are about to move up, and now how would you navigate? Because obviously there is a window where if they are on this side of the window, they are in theory less competitive than if they would be here. So how you would manage this transition?
If I had a choice, if I had a magic wand, I would probably remove all weight classes for young lifters, especially for sub-juniors. I don't think that having sub-juniors focusing on weight is actually a good thing, especially in the sport of powerlifting. Right now, the sport is growing, but until it reaches certain heights, it is still just an expensive hobby for most people. And I would rather, people like move up weight classes or not have weight classes, because like the whole reason people have weight classes is just to compete with one another, right? It's just like to kind of like make it more competitive, right? Because obviously you can't say like someone who's 60 kilos versus someone who's 80 kilos. How do you compare that metric? But if everybody in the weight class, the competition gets it gets tighter, right? And it becomes more interesting for people in the weight class with tighter competitions. However, I do think that with younger lifters is that there is a conversation in strength and conditioning of like long-term athletic development, right? LTAD, which is a very common term used, and trying to manage specificity of like training protocols for younger lifters, right? Or like playing various sports, and while weight training, when I say weight training, I mean just resistance training is generally beneficial for most people. Like, is there any benefit for someone who to consistently just do squat, bench, and deadlift, right? Consistently trying to be in a low weight class at a young age? Probably not. I would say so I would say in general, most young lifters shouldn't be cutting weight. People are starting to start lifting at a younger age, right? And I think people should know that when it comes to a lot of like strength sports, right, muscle gain, it takes more time. So every time you go into the gym, you should ask yourself, how am I maximizing my time spent, rather than, I'm going to do this to like cut a couple of corners, lose a couple of kilos, just so like can be a little bit stronger in the short run. Obviously, this is also highly dependent on the fact that if you want to be in the sport for a long time, like I said, my bias as a coach and someone who loves the sport is I want people to enjoy the sport for a long time. There will be people who be like, okay, I'm just going to give this sport 2 to 3 years, right? And after that, I'm done, right? Then obviously the approach then will be very different for someone who's like, I'm going to be in the sport for 10 years. If we look at the sport of powerlifting, I don't think that we are anywhere near the growth, where the sport has really grown. So I think that currently, like kilo for kilo, strongest lifter in the world is this lifter called Austin Perkins. So he's a 74 kilo lifter, and he recently put up a training total of like 910.5, something ridiculous, right? And that shows the peak of what this person can do. But the reason why I say that the sport has not yet grown, because there's only one person that can do that, right? Because if statistically there will be someone that actually can do something that's like absolutely incredible just by pure stats, right? There's always going to be that one outlier somewhere, right? But the fact of the matter is that I would say that the sport has grown if there are like 3 to 4 people or 5 people, that can even come close, because the next person that is like, close to this lifter, totals like 850 is still a lot of weight, but it's quite far apart, right?
Yeah, behind, yeah.
So the gap is really big, right? But that also signals to me that the sport hasn't really grown. I also do think that the incentive for powerlifting is not high, because being someone who is muscular, or even for weightlifting, who is more fast twitch, there are other sports that better utilizes those function that gives you a better return, especially if you are trying to pursue it professionally,
100%.
right? So the fact of the matter is that it's like a chicken or egg question, right? Does the sport how can the sport grow to the point where it starts attracting talent, right? So that we can get more people into this sport, or do we have to get talent in the sport first before the sport can grow, right? So it's like, which comes first, right? So I don't know what that is, but it is also not really surprising that you see a lot of lifters that are successful in powerlifting used to be like former athletes that are just not good enough. Maybe they are really, really strong, right, and really fast, but they're just too short to play like sport,
Rugby or American football.
or even like basketball, right? Or even like, I mean, football players are quite, relatively shorter, but they are still, if you're 160 centimeters, it's very unlikely that you're going to do well in any sport that requires physical contact. But if you're muscular, then, and you're short, you will lack some other aspects, maybe like speed, because if you're short, your legs are short, right? Meaning that the ability to cover more ground is lower. So certain sports, there are certain like proportions. And for powerlifters, right, I think that they have a really good strength quality, right? But they lack certain other physical attributes that would probably put them into like professional sports. So that is something that probably, it almost seems like until the sport is big enough, and I don't know how that's going to happen, powerlifting is kind of like doomed towards like getting like second tier. When I say second tier, I don't mean in a bad manner, but it's more like the top tier genetic pool will probably go to sports that pay more money. Then those that don't make it, you come to powerlifting or you do CrossFit. Or now, if you can't do CrossFit, you do like high rocks, right? Which is like the new thing where everybody's like doing. So there are like different levels of things that people can pursue. And I guess for me, as someone who is big on physical activity, as like whatever that you enjoy that keeps you moving, go for it. It's probably beneficial for your health.
Right. I think this is very important, that people find anything they are able to sustain for a long time. That's the point of it. We talked a little bit about what would be the weight management and nutritional management of a powerlifter, where the goal is performance versus longevity in the sport versus health. I'm hearing that you are skewing more into health goes first, then longevity in the sport, then performance. Basically for all the lifters, for the reasons you mentioned. Is it a fair judgment?
I don't think they are separate, right? To a certain extent, I think that they are like concentric circles, right? Health obviously would be right in the middle, and then it grows outwards. The reason why that is the case, because I think the way we approach this is we always start from like improving your base. We are going to maximize your ability as a human being first, because once again, in a sport where the trade-off is actually, most people do powerlifting for their interests, and most people do powerlifting for their enjoyment. Monetary rewards are minor. If you have a well-paying job but you absolutely hate your job, people still do that. Most people, or maybe you do a job to sustain your family if you have people dependent on you, right? Most people don't do powerlifting for that, which means that most of the time people do that for enjoyment. And if your health as a baseline is not well handled, right, that would diminish your enjoyment, right? If you're consistently hurt, right, then you would not enjoy it. If you are dieting so much that you always fall sick, you won't be able to train well. So to really maximize that your ability to enjoy the sport, you have to keep like an acceptable level of health. On the flip side, where someone is just eating so much food that just to gain weight, and they are having like diabetes, and the doctor said, if you don't lose weight now, you're gonna die. You will shorten your lifespan by 5 years. The guy will probably be like, okay, cool, maybe now I have to like lose weight and sacrifice my powerlifting gains because of that. And therefore, I think that you need like a baseline level of health that's acceptable. And then as people progress, I think that then we start to consider what are certain trade-offs in my health that I'm willing to make in the short run, right? So occasionally like dieting, performing some form of rapid weight cutting strategies, right? And doing your best to mitigate the health impacts, obviously maybe lifting. If you have a competition coming up, you're actually training a little bit harder, right? So I'm saying, and training harder, you would definitely increase injury risk if you don't manage training load well, right? So, and I do think that the way I see things is that let's really look at ways that I have that acceptable level of health, and then look at what are short-term health trade-offs that I can make to pursue that goal. And then I would say if that's worth it or not. Because obviously health, like I say, is very intrinsically linked with your performance. That if you are sick, you're not going to perform well, right? Most of the time. If you have I think the way I see things is they are all kind of like linked. And I think that someone just has to decide what is the trade-off they're willing to bear in the short term to maximize certain performance gains.
Right. I think it's a nice framework to use for thinking about, okay, I'm a lifter, I have my performance goals, and athletes at any level, some people will do sports for this athletic endeavor, for trying to be better, for the competition, for challenging yourself, and so on. And it's easy to forget that the big picture was to make yourself better in the long run, to use the sport to grow in other areas of your life too. So bringing this long-term approach and this concentric circles you describe, I really like this approach for that reason, that you can use it to zoom out a little bit and look at yourself as an athlete within yourself as a human being and a person engaged in all the other things. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries. Hopefully, I mean, it's just a way to see things. Like I said, it is much more important to look at it from a sport that is like, at the end of the day, you put worth into, like, the worth of the sport is given by you because there are no like external rewards. So you said that, what is the difference between hitting a 5 kilo PR and a 7.5 kilo PR total on the platform, right? It's 2.5 kilos, but the worth, like if you have to sacrifice every single thing, like let's just say, someone like you have to like not spend time with your family, and someone because of that, their partners complain, and then that like lead to a marriage being broken up and all that, or relationship broken up for like 2.5 kilos. I'm like, some people might think it's worth it, but at the end of the day, like the fact of the matter is that two individuals might have the same improvement, but would feel differently about it. Shows that the worth that they're getting is actually from themselves, right? So you kind of like internalize that worth, and to a certain point, you determine what is important for you. And I do think that most people seek out things. People would rather seek out pleasure than pain, given a choice. So in the long run of things, right, the more enjoyable you can do things, the better it will be. And enjoyment is, like I said, tend to be linked towards like health, whether that's mentally or physically.
Yeah, I really like that. Okay, we have to talk about weight loss because it's a big chunk of your research too, specifically manipulating weight within a short period of time. So how short? What are the consequences? What are the risks? What would you consider to be worth it? We talked a little bit about it, but let's bring it together in this particular context.
Yeah, I think that most important thing first, I always say, is you plan backwards, right? You look at how far you are away from competition, and then how far you are from the weight class that you have to be in, and then give yourself a reasonable amount of time, factoring in lifestyle factors. People with more busy lifestyles should create more breathing room for a slower rate of weight loss compared to other people. And then you start planning, how much weight can I lose? I genuinely think that whatever people think, I think that we are very good at overestimating our abilities, right? So whatever you think you can do, give yourself more time, right? Having a little bit of a buffer, especially when it comes to weight loss, is probably a good idea anyway, right? It allows more enjoyment, it allows more flexibility, it also improves certain adherence. I mean, research has shown that like refeed weeks, don't necessarily improve like metabolism or anything like that, but it increases adherence in individuals, right? So that helps to allow people to actually achieve their goals if they actually set realistic timeframes, and then ensure that whatever you're doing is very minimally disruptive to what your current obligations are, I would say, whether that's work, that's family, because like I said, powerlifting, you do powerlifting. I don't think it's worth sacrificing your relationships or your career on the altar of powerlifting. So first of all, you plan backwards, then you look at how well can you perform whatever you plan to do while maintaining your current lifestyle as much as possible. And then look at essentially like certain rates are in bodybuilding research, we have rates of roughly 0.5% to 1.5% of weight loss or fat or weight loss per week to minimize muscle loss, right? So if someone has higher levels of body fat, they can gravitate towards 1.5%. If someone has less body fat, they will gravitate towards 0.5% per week. However, this research is done in physique athletes, and when it comes to like physique athletes and athletes who need to perform in their sport, it's very different, because if you're a physique athlete, you're a bodybuilder, you just need to have enough energy in you to flex on stage and not die.
Very different.
Very different from putting a lot of weight or lifting a lot of weight, right?
Possibly
so I do think
the biggest weight you have ever lifted in the exercise.
Exactly. So I think that even though the rate of weight loss is 0.5% per week, all right, on the lower end for physique athletes, I think that even if a powerlifter achieves half that rate in order to ensure that their training performance is maintained, I think that is something worth as well. So we look at what is an average weight, and like I said, everybody's different. Someone who has a more stressful life, they have to lose less weight without impacting their performance, where someone is just like chilling, most of the time, just don't have much obligations, they might be able to lose more weight and not really be impacted by it. And so you lose weight and on a consistent basis, right? And then when it comes to like 5 days out, then it depends on what are certain methods of acute body mass manipulation you want to perform. I would say the big two methods that most people perform would be gut volume manipulation. So you manage the food weight in your gut predominantly due to fiber intake. So that's the first one. The second one would be some form of fluid manipulation. We call this like water loading. So for the first one, you manipulate your fiber. So for 3 days, what you do is that you put fiber, you basically cut out as much fiber as possible. Research papers currently show like, less than 10 to 13 grams of fiber, but people in that study, I think that they consume roughly 30 grams of fiber a day, right? So it's roughly around 60% of fiber reduction at minimum for there to be an impact that can be observed for 3 days. So what that does is that basically when everybody goes to the bathroom in the morning, right, they don't really clear their gut out immediately, right? So every time when you go to the bathroom, you don't completely clear your guts, and then you eat more fiber isn't digestible, right? And then you basically get more food weight. So if you're not eating fiber, what you're hoping is that in 3 days, you basically completely clear your gut, and then all your food weight in your gut is gone. So that's the first bit. The current research shows that most people can lose up to 0.8 to 1.6%, depending on the individual, depending on how much fiber they consume, right? And things like that. Then when you look at fluid loading, fluid manipulation, what people do is they increase their fluid intake exponentially for 3 to 4 days. Current research shows 1 liter per 10 kilograms of body weight. So if you are 80 kilos, you would drink 8 liters of fluids. What this does is that it upregulates certain hormones in your body. And then the final day, you basically cut your water out or you greatly reduce it. And what this does is that the hormone roughly have a 12 to 16 hour lagging period before it resumes its normal function. So during that time when you're not actually drinking, your body still perceives as yourself in a hyperhydrated state, and you're actually just getting rid of all the fluids through pee. And currently, we actually see that you lose probably around 2%. So if you combine those values, right, you can lose up to 3.5%, up to 4%, together, all right, with those values, right, from the gut volume manipulation and fluid loading. So those are kind of like the common methods used. The other method that people use is also another form of fluid manipulation, but via dehydration through heat. So people just like sit in the sauna and sweat, right? That tend to be slightly more risky because, first of all, any form of fluid manipulation has already a potential risk because you are essentially dehydrating your body, right? Whether you are doing it through water loading and dehydrating your water through peeing, or whether you're dehydrating yourself to sweating. But the added element of heat actually increases the risk because heat stroke is a real thing, and people often underestimate the combination of heat plus dehydration, right, is multiplicative in terms of the negative impact, right? Because water also acts as a buffer, right, and acts as a way to manage our internal body temperature. So now you're losing the fluids, you are losing the substance that manages heat, right? I think that people often think that, oh, if I lose 200 grams to heat and I feel this way, I lose 600 grams, I would probably feel 3 times worse, or something like that. But I think that that is a linear relationship. But like I said, I do think it's more exponential because every time you lose fluids, the heat has a greater impact on you, right? So the negative impact is actually really exponential. And, I don't think there are no reported cases where people just die of dehydration from water loading itself, but there are cases where you combine dehydration with heat, then that people suffer like cardiac arrest. Because if you think about it, right, the less fluids you have, your heart has to pump harder, right, to get the blood circulating because there's less blood flow to transport, and then people just die, and obviously enzymatic functions would start breaking down. That's the reason why our body likes the 37 degrees Celsius the temperature. So things like that, right? So those are the elements of weight cutting rapid weight cutting that people should be really well aware of, right? Those negative impact. And I do think that some of it is actually very necessary for some certain individuals, but there are always ways to actually be better, right? You can get yourself heat adapted. There's a paper showing that 12 hours of heat adaptation across a month increase the resilience to heat and also prevent electrolyte loss during sweating and allow an increase of sweat rate. So you sweat quicker, meaning that you spend less time in the heat, and you also don't lose as much electrolytes.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So what they did was they did 1 hour per session, 3 times per week for 4 weeks. So basically 12 hours, 12 sessions, 12 1-hour sessions. But let's face it, do people actually have access to that amount of time, right? Like I said, most people have day jobs, right? If you ask someone to do that, they'd be like, oh, 1 hour, right? And then I have to do that 3 times a week. On top of that, powerlifters already take like 4 hours to train because, after doing 5 reps, they rest for 15 minutes because that's too much cardio for powerlifters. And then now you have to add another additional hour
which is also cardio, because if you sit for an hour in sauna, this is hard work. You are sweating and it's actually hard.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, that is definitely a proof of concept.
That's a big issue, isn't it? How to bring it all together in a relevant context.
Yeah, I think there's something called like the Anna Karenina effect. Basically just says that, happy families are happy for the same reason, but unhappy families are unhappy for multiple different reasons. Meaning that for something to like work perfectly well, right, there needs to be a lot of things being perfect, but there can be one thing that can like just like screw things up, right? And for someone it could be like multiple things. So I think that, when it comes to kind of like creating that perfect situation, and obviously everybody's different, we need to be able to like take something and translate it for them, for that specific individual. So I do think that there are certain necessary components of success, right? Although I do think in the sport of powerlifting it's a little bit more flexible compared to other stuff, where like, for example, if you're running a 100-meter sprint, your margin of error is a little bit smaller. So for powerlifting, the scope is bigger. So I do think that when it comes to necessary components for success for powerlifting, it's actually wider than most sport, right? But I do think that as coaches, we need to know what are those and identify those so that the people that we're working with can capitalize on those elements that would help them be successful.
Would you have a take-home message for lifters and for coaches?
I think that for lifters is don't believe everything you see on the internet. I guess this is a very useful information now. I think understanding survivorship bias is very important. People talk about the success of what this person does, and then try to replicate it, right? But that's just survivorship bias. There might be 10,000 people that actually did the same thing, actually fail, right? But there's this one person, and and you try to follow that, you might just be another stat of this person that failed, right? So just because a lifter online, that you admire, right, does something, doesn't mean that it will translate to you. The person clearly is a survivor of whatever they've done. It's like kind of like the Bulgarian training method where weightlifters, you just put them to like a crazy thing, and the people that come out is all the people that are basically built to be beasts, and then the rest of them, they basically just die, right? It's basically like a Spartan weightlifting, right? Where the Spartan kids, they just throw them into the wild, and if you don't come back and you cannot survive in the wild, you're dead, right? And then therefore all Spartan warriors are like elite because the rest are all dead, So I think that that's very important. I do think that for lifters that is a big thing, because not to mention that psychologically it matters as well, because if you think that this is the magic formula, and for this lifter, if you do it and it doesn't work for you, you'll be like, man, I've just wasted all my effort. And psychologically, that can mess with you. I often just say that disappointment is basically unmet expectations. And when it comes to certain unmet expectations, you have to if you don't meet your goals, you look at it from two perspectives. You ask yourself, is your effort not sufficient, or are your expectations unrealistic? So I think that sometimes, if you have that really unrealistic expectation and you put in all your effort in, you're still not going to make it, right? And that can create disappointment, and multiple disappointment would essentially cause burnout. So I would say that is probably very important for people to think about, is don't believe whatever you see on the internet, understand survivorship bias, and most of the time, whatever works on the internet for someone will unlikely work for you unless you're exactly like the person, which is probably also unlikely unless you're that person's twin brother or sister. Yeah, I guess for coaches, I think that there needs to be more communications with scientists, or I think that the whole like science-based lifting versus like bro lifting, I don't think that's productive conversations, because the fact of the matter is that while like scientists, there are certain people who's like, oh, this is the science, you have to do what it says. But when it comes, if you actually understand, like being in research, you understand the limitation of science, right? And there is no such things as, oh, like because the science say this is the truth, right? Because science is not truth with a capital T. Science is a process, right, to help us probably get closer to the truth, and that might change. So I think that experience as well plays a role into that, right? How much you weigh experience on the evidentiary scale might vary with individual. Like, say if you have someone who is like, for example, if this person does this and everything works, right, and you are training the twin brother or the twin sister, like it's likely that whatever you do might likely work for this person more compared to if you're just training some other person that's completely unrelated, right? So I think that the whole conversation, I think that training and coaching can be a little bit more productive if we integrate the ways of based on this scientific, I wouldn't say discovery, because we're not really discovering much when it comes to lifting, right? Based on this finding that we have, how relevant it is to the population that we're coaching. And then the conversation from the coach would be like, oh, but these are actually not the things that we are actually, it doesn't apply to us because we don't fit certain models. And most of the time we see that when it comes to resistance training exercises, we never really get a chance to work with elite lifters, for the most part, because if they're elite, they probably are not going to go to your lab 3 times a week to do your study. So I think that trying to bridge that gap is going to be very, very important. And I think that gap can only be bridged through conversation, right? Like after finishing my PhD, I have a lot of like colleagues and acquaintances in like fully in academia. So I try to bridge that gap. I say like, oh, if you find something like this, let me know. Then I see it. What we dig deeper, right? We don't say that if you follow this training program from the study, we say like, what is the principle that underlies this? And we see if we can like import that principle, that underlying principle into how we coach, right? And then from there on, we say this is what we can try then in the real world, whether it works or not, right? And there's no guarantee that it will work because, like I said, you are trying something new, right? So you also have to be open to the possibility of it not working out. So yeah, I think coaches and exercise scientists should have less of a combative stance with one another. But I just think that, yeah, the unfortunate thing is that when it comes to sports, there's a lot of ego going on. I want to be the guy who trained this, like the star, right? I don't want to share my credit with anybody. I do think if people want to grow the field in a broader way, right, more conversations should happen. So yeah, those are like my 2 final messages, I guess, for all the athletes and the coaches.
Very well. Let's leave it at that. I have 2 short questions. I finish with the first one is, what is your favorite lift?
I would always say the deadlift. I think that something that is your favorite. I don't think that I think this is a general point, but I think that doing something that you're solely because of passion is very overrated, because people tend to like the things that they're good at. And the only reason why I like the deadlift is because I'm like 5'10", but my wingspan is a wingspan of someone who is 6 foot, which means I have really long arms, which is good for deadlifting, and therefore it's my best lift. But it also makes it absolutely atrocious for bench press, which means that even though I'm like a bro at heart and like benching, to have like big packs and stuff, I still hate the bench press because like I find it really hard to improve. Whereas the deadlift, I'm like, my arms are so long, I pull sumo as well. So, anytime you can go into the gym and you can deadlift 200 kilos, right? It's relatively impressive. But I think for a bench, you need to at least bench 140, or at least more than 2 plates. But unfortunately, because of my long arms, I cannot just walk into the gym and just bench more than that. I actually need to train up to that. Whereas deadlift, I think that, on any good day, if I warm up well, I can pull 200 kilos. So the deadlift would have to be my favorite lift.
Right. Okay. And the last question is where people can find you if they want to follow your work or ask a question. Where can they find you on the internet?
So I think most people can just contact me on Instagram. So Kedric.Reformance. I think you will probably tag me in the podcast as well. So you can just go there, right? If people want to reach out to me, they can, just Instagram message me. Although I might take some time to respond, right? I don't spend as much time on social media anymore. So yeah, that's the best place to find me, because most likely I'll point you to my email after that. So, and if people want to seek coaching, on my Instagram profile, there's like a coaching form where people can just put in their request, and then I check that twice a week, right? So when I see a request, I'll just respond accordingly.
Thank you so much, Kedric. It was a pleasure.
No worries. Pleasure is mine. Hopefully your listeners benefit from this.
Thank you.